Stay tuned to meet a man who dealt with PTSD and tried to end his life. My name is Jason Bradley, and you're watching Urban Report. Hello and welcome to Urban Report. My guest today is Tom Mann, and he is a man with a powerful testimony. Welcome to Urban Report, Tom.
Jason, glad to be here.
Good to have you here. I mean, we've worked together for years. You used to work here, and a lot of people at home have heard your voice, but now they're getting to see your face too.
That may be a good or bad thing. I don't know, so.
Now, you worked here before I even got here, and this set.
What took
place
let me just, we were just talking about this a moment ago, and that is, I remember when there was no Dare to Dream, and I remember when it was a dream, and I can remember sitting here with your mom and interviewing her probably for the first time, and coming up with a video talking about a network that didn't exist.
Wow.
And I think the set had just been finished. It was around that time. So it's kind of like a unique thing for me to sit here because I remember the beginnings of it and how it all started. It was an exciting time.
Praise the Lord. And to see where God has led it, you know, this far.
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
You know, when I worked with you, I had no idea about your journey. And I remember going to the Marion Seventh-day Adventist Church in Illinois, Marion, Illinois, and you were preaching, and you shared a little bit of your testimony, and I was blown away. And I was like, you know, I have to have Tom here for an Urban Report.
Good.
Why don't you share with our viewers just a little bit about your upbringing?
I had a great upbringing, and it's probably, I think for me, the thing is that it was such a blessing. I grew up in a Christian home, had a mom and dad that loved me, encouraged me. I was quite kind of a creative child, and encouraged both my brother and I. Had a brother. I still have a brother, and we grew up in a wonderful environment. Went to a private Christian school for 12 years, steeped in Bible. Everything you could think of that was positive, I mean, I had. It was just, the word may be charmed. I mean, didn't grow up in a very affluent home, but I grew up in a typical home. My mom and dad both worked. My mom worked, helped put me through private Christian school. It was that kind of thing. And really had just a great life growing up. I knew I was a little bit different, and I say that because I wanted to go in radio and TV even when I was young. I don't know why, but I did. I had a creative bent, I mentioned that, and I found I had problems in school. I understood everything, but I just couldn't read that well, and I would kind of fake my way through all of that. I got through school. I spent a lot of time in summer school, and my grades looked great because of that. And I got into college because I was the student government president of my high school. They call it the student of Commissioner Affairs or something, Commissioner of Student Affairs, one of those things. And I was that. I got into college because of that. My ACT scores, those things were pretty low. And what I found out as I went along is I had a little bit of what's called visual dyslexia. And which I found out to be a blessing because that's what kind of pushes me in the creative side of things. You don't have to have all the facts, but you're able to kind of put things together without the facts.
So what is the visual dyslexia? What is
It's a little bit different. It's not when you're reading, turning things around. And I had a gentleman who was, I think, doing his doctorate, his dissertation or something, I forget what, psychology, and he happened to be my principal at my high school. And I was working on a radio show for him, and it was I had to do this big creative process, and one day he said, "Can I study you?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "I think I know what's going on with you." And he said, "Because you can do these things, but you have these," he said, "You weren't that great of a student." I'm like, "Yeah, I know that." And I avoided it with a passion, you know. And I was in college still at the time, but he did that. And the visual dyslexia, it's where it's basically you can read things, but I have to read them many times over. Now I could look like, here you could look at a teleprompter and I could read that for some reason. on camera, but if you give me a big book, somebody says, this is a great book, read this. I could spend 6 months on the first chapter just reading over and over and over again. I found out I have to read out loud, and it's just something where I'm not able to process it going in.
So
And you just learn a little bit differently. Some people call them auditory visual learner. I'm really that bent, but it's a little bit more than that. That's what I was diagnosed with.
So basically, is it like you're trying to read something, and in order to internalize it, you have to read it
out loud?
Aloud and multiple times to get it to
I
stick?
say it's kind of like if somebody wears glasses like I do, older I get, the more and thicker they get. If you take your glasses off, everything's not as clear. It's kind of the same thing with me, where I can read. I could read out loud to you with no problem. Those kids' books are great, the little bitty ones, the Dr. Seuss and all those things. I was great at those. I never had a problem with that, but anything deeper than that. But other than that, I really didn't have any problems, and that was really, I felt, an asset, something you learn differently, you process differently, and it's kind of a thing. God made me that way, and that was okay, and that was fine. So
yes. Okay, and you were coming up, you went to college. Did you finish college?
No. And the reason was, part of it was I just didn't like school. I went to 2 colleges one time. I was going to Bible college because I kind of felt called to be in the ministry or be a pastor. And then I was going to a secular college for broadcast communications. Well, I begged the professors and everyone, I want an internship. And I just started taking advanced classes. I don't know how I got away with that. And I got into the broadcast classes at the same time. 2 weeks after I got out of high school, I went around to all the radio stations, said I want to work on the air, and they're like, yeah, kid, you can work on the air. But this one lady said, listen, go to the college, which I was going to at the time, University of Memphis. They have a campus radio station, nobody's there. And so I went there and volunteered my time, 5 to 6 hours a day, and learned how to work on the air 2 weeks out of high school. And then I wound up working in radio. I worked at multiple radio stations. And by the time I was 21, I was working at one of the top radio stations in town. And it just kept growing from there. So I was already in the business. I was doing some TV, all kinds of things at that time. And I just, I was doing what I was going to school for. And I remember I had a manager one day, program director at a television station, a radio station I was working at. And I said, hey, can I get a raise when I graduate and get my degree? That was about a year from there. And he looked at me, he said, no. And I said, why? He said, why don't you change your major and go into business or something else? He said, I didn't hire you because you have your degree. I hired you because you're good at what you do. And for some reason, I just took that as this thing, well, maybe I should just not go to school. And I did that. But it's interesting. I had almost 4 years of college, and then the high school I went to was very academically inclined. So it wasn't that I didn't have any of that. It was just, I guess, me being me. I'm like, oh, if I can do this and I don't have to do that, that's great. Yeah, if I can stay away from the books, I'm happy. If I can just go on the air, that's again, that was my thinking. But and it worked out really well.
Well, yes, and you have that voice. Like sometimes I'll turn on Channel 3 WSIL, and then I hear you, and I'm like, oh, that's Tom Mann. Yeah. You have the voice for it.
And the face, they sometimes say.
And oh, that's messed up. Okay, so you went through a couple situations, you had 3 major events. But before we get to those 3 major events, how long were you in radio? How long were you in TV?
For about a decade, I was on the air about 6 days a week, which was normal in radio back at that time. And I worked almost every kind of format, and I learned so much, and it was an amazing experience. I can remember working at these secular radio stations, and I remember there was always one individual there who was some kind of a believer, and that was the person that taught me how to do things. And everywhere I went, and I learned, that's how I learned. You learn, from working in it. And I wound up working in television. I wound up working, throughout. So I had a really broad background. And somewhere around, I got married, and about the time I got married, I started a production company. I thought, well, I'll do some commercials on the side, and I started doing that. And that kept growing. And then one of the things I was excited about is a lot of ministries would hire me to do their work for everything from their cassette, back in the day, cassette tape duplication, their editing and putting together radio programs, those things. I did a lot of that. And then I moved into TV later. And my companies just started growing. I started with one, then I had another. And so that went really well. That was just, as I said, it was more like Charmed. It was just it just kept growing. It just got bigger and bigger. And I kind of got used to that, where it seemed very easy, where you just did things and you were able to make money at it. And at the same time, I was excited because I got to work with ministries and other things like that. And then during that time, I got an interest. I had a fascination as a kid about what firefighters and paramedics did. And I always wanted to be one, I think. And that's really what it was.
Okay.
So I remember some of the television series that were on networks were showing up with police officers and what have you, and I wanted to find out how they were taping that. So I got involved, and I wound up writing with firefighters and paramedics, EMTs, and the like for almost 10 years, and capturing them, trying to develop first a documentary, then working on a television series.
Okay.
And that went on for almost 10 years.
Wow.
And I had to go through training, and so I could go inside of burning buildings and tape them doing what they're doing.
Wow. So you went inside burning buildings and taped them in action.
It was a blast. I mean, when I was in my 20s, my 30s, that was like, it was just awesome. It was an adrenaline rush. I can't explain to you what that's like. And at the same time, I was fascinated with these individuals that were willing to lay down their lives. And I started experiencing that. I had friends that actually died. I remember being on the scenes of incidences where guys you were working with, they didn't come back.
Yeah.
And that was very hard. That was the reality of it. Rode in New York City. This is before 9/11, and that was an amazing experience. Standing in front of the World Trade Centers back in the 90s, and I was standing next to a guy who was a battalion chief that had been at the first bombing of the World Trade Center, and he was standing there looking at me one day, and he said, you know, these buildings, if you want to bring these down, you can't do what they did back in the early 90s. He said, I was there. He was one of the commanders or something, and he said, you got to blow them up from above. He said, if you get a tanker truck, and he was pointing up at the top of the World Trade, he said, and we're standing right below it. He said, if you put a tanker truck up there and it's ignited, these buildings will come down like in a pancake. And he described what happened on 9/11. This was like 3 or 4 years before that. And I was there writing with him. Didn't think about it until that day. And I had these amazing moments that I really loved. I loved doing that. And but at some point, I went to mass shootings, all kinds of things. And at some point, it started to affect me, and I didn't really realize it. I was working on projects. I remember learning about PTSD, learning about how it affects you, and developing things for firefighters and paramedics, EMTs. I worked for some training networks for them, and I got into that. A lot of footage I shot wound up being on networks, and just saw anything and everything. You name it.
And so basically that took a huge toll.
It did. I didn't realize it. I was still just doing great. I didn't bother me. I could walk into about any scene, and it got where, okay, fine, this is such and such. You just got used to it. I used to hear that. And that was going on. So that was going on. Business was going on. I had ebbs and flows and things like that. I had 2 kids. I mean, I talk about it basically, though life was great. 2.2 kids. You're living the dream.
2 kids.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what they say. But,
okay.
Why do they say that?
I don't know
why they say that. But, you had all that. At the time, wonderful marriage, everything that I knew. I taught the young marrieds class at my church and actively involved in those kinds of, those things were going on. So I guess as I think back on it, I'm thinking right now, it's just like it was great. Charmed life, honestly. Everything was great.
And so at what point, where was the turning point? Where did things hit rock bottom for you?
Well, and here's the thing, and God turns a lot of things around how things work. My first wife one day just up and said she didn't want to be married anymore. I did not see that coming in a million years. And I think I've shared part of this story before, but it devastated me. I was like, do what? In fact, we had our usual date night. I remember we would go somewhere and eat.
Yeah.
She told me that, and I thought she was joking. I even laughed. I said, that's not a good thing to joke about. She said, I'm serious. And within 2 weeks, she was gone. That was a huge shock because, first of all, nobody in my family had ever been divorced. I kind of grew up in a background that, in my mind, if you were divorced or anything like that, you could never really serve in church again. You could never, ever be in ministry. You could never, ever. It was over with. I mean, that's all it was. So everything was over. I mean, I remember I had to step away from all my positions and things. It was hard to work with young marrieds when your marriage, and it's understandable. I get that.
Yeah.
But I had to do that. It was very difficult, and that was tough. At the same time, shortly after that, I wound up, getting a document telling me these are the days I get to see my kids, and these are the days I don't get to see my kids.
Yeah.
Now, that inside of me is like, you're not going to tell me what to do. That's really the first thing. Well, so these are my kids. And I was the dad. I remember going every night. I'm the one that went in and prayed with them, and I was busy, but I remember doing that. That was a big thing for me to go in and, had fun. I played with them, stir them up before they go to bed, that kind of thing. But I never saw that. And there are things that were going on with my first wife I didn't realize. And this is, again, part of the healing and things that come back. And it just ripped my guts out, I think.
Yeah.
Sherry Peters, and we started talking about this. She mentioned one time, she said, you were just kind of like all the life was drained out of you. And I said, that's what happened.
Yeah.
So I had that, and then I started having, I knew some things were going on with me and my thinking through all the things I was working on through those years. That was going on. And then within 6 months after that,
All the things you were working on, like the fire.
the fire and those things,
and all that stuff.
that was bothering me. And the last one had happened during 9/11, and I was invited to go to the Pentagon, and I said, no, I can't do it. And before that, I'd been to a mass casualty shooting. I mean, where 2 firefighters were killed, a sheriff's deputy, and several people, and I was there, and there's so many details of that. You're on the scene of that, and, I had to sit in the room with one of the victims, a body for 20 or 30 minutes, and you have these things, and so you're dealing with that. Individuals watching people burn to death, all these things were, I had witnessed through those years, shootings. I got shot at, I got pinned down by gunfire. I had these things that happened to me. They sound really, over the edge, and at the time I didn't even talk to them about it. It was just kind of what I did. And I didn't tell everybody these things were happening because I was worried they would not let me continue doing what I was doing. So I kept these things really tight. When it would happen, I'm like, don't tell anybody, because I was worried. I want to continue shooting and working. And I wasn't a firefighter, I wasn't a paramedic. So I was just a videographer, I was a media producer.
But even the Bible says, by beholding we become changed.
Yeah.
And so you were beholding all these
this stuff.
scenes, you were seeing all of these things, taking it all in. You weren't necessarily participating, but you were capturing it in your mind, and so it had an effect on your life.
So that happened. And then the other thing, just I'll tell you, was as within 6 months I lost my house, I lost my businesses with an S, I lost everything, went from having everything to having nothing. Wow. So we go to, all of a sudden I'm having to go, my parents are having to get me a car. I have to go live with them. I have nothing. I had everything just 6 months to a year before that. I have to go back and get a job, and I'm all of a sudden back working in television station, and driving a satellite truck, doing live shots, and pretty much by myself. It was a very lonely time. a friend of mine, he kept calling me Job. And it was really, and you know, the hard part was I would just sit there, why, how did this happen?
When I started looking at your story and I was thinking about your testimony and everything, I was like, this sounds like a Job type experience.
It was. And because you look back and I'm like, okay, I didn't deserve anything for this to happen. You're going, okay, God, why did you let this thing happen? I literally, all these questions, and in fact, the book of Job made sense to me now. Those little questions and the things that were going on, I thought, wow.
I'm glad that you said that. Why did you let these things happen? Because, oftentimes when we run into tough times, people blame God.
Yeah, he's not,
but he's not the one who caused it. He allowed it to happen. And you were asking, why did he let it happen?
And the other thing came into play. For the first time, I realized that there is an enemy that prowls around like a roaring lion and seeking those who would devour. In this life, you will have trouble. I never read any of those scriptures because everything was charmed and wonderful.
Yeah.
I didn't understand that, because my thing was, God, I've been doing all these things, and I did a lot of things. And I would go through that list. And finally, I began to realize God really wanted to change my heart, for one thing, because I think my view up until that time was, okay, God, I'm going to do this, and you bless it. And it wasn't a conscious thing, but I think we often do that. And the whole point is, no, wait. It works the other way around. I've given you these gifts. I've given you these things. And so I'm not along for the ride. I'm not in the back of the seat of this bus, or the plane. You forget, I am the pilot. And I think that was part of what I had to learn. That's part of what I had to learn. Okay. There's another thing took place in me. I remember just a year before that happened, I remember a friend of mine, I wound up getting involved in a relationship and his marriage fell apart. And I remember coming home and he came and told me what happened, how remorseful he was. And I remember I came home and I was so incensed. And I remember looking at my wife and said, you know what? I'm glad I'm not like him. I'm glad that, how could those things happen? Well, here I was in a situation that I didn't even do any of that. But I found myself in the same situation. And God started teaching me through that. The other hard part too was, I remember going through this and two things happened. A good friend of mine, who was a pastor of my church, encouraged me to actually leave the church. And it sounds strange.
That really does. But
because of the rumor mill. Because it's like, there's no way that Tom's wife would have left unless he was involved in an affair or something else. And people in the church were saying this. It was a very large church.
Wow.
And that was very hard for me. I was devastated by that. Not by him saying that. In fact, I wound up going to another pastor had said, listen, hey, fine, we have a lot of broken people here, you can come on in. We have a lot of people like you that are divorced and that are drug addicts and everything else, come on in. It was a great place, actually, I went to. It was different. That was hard. The second thing was, I had been doing some business and a young couple came in, and I remember they came in, I was late getting work done. I had literally stopped doing things. I'd lost all my equipment. And I gave money back to them and all kinds of other things. And they prayed for me. And it wasn't 2 weeks later, they, along with several others, filed lawsuits against me. So I was being sued. All these things everything was going on. That shook me because I was just like, God, how could you let this happen?
Yeah. And so are those the things, is that what led up to you making the decision to try and take your life?
Yeah, it got where it's hard. I could have never imagined thinking this way, but I got to the point where the marriage was gone, everything I owned was gone, my business, my whole plan to retire in life was gone. You can think of it that way. I look back on it now. That was, almost 20 years ago. And then all these other things, it was just, I couldn't believe it. And then you felt like everybody abandoned you. It was just, and then I'm living by myself. My kids would come over and they would stay, and then the nights they were gone, I just remember crying myself to sleep. I got where I couldn't work. I couldn't remember how to edit, and I'm edit and I shoot. I do all kinds of media. I couldn't remember what I was doing.
Yeah.
And
It's like your world was just turned
oh yeah,
upside
it was turned
down.
upside down.
Yeah.
So I started, for the first time in my life, I thought it would be better if I wasn't here. And I started thinking about that. And another thing I was mentioning before, and I don't know if it's part of the factor, but I had been put on some medicines because people were encouraging me, well, you're very creative. You need to be more cognitive. And basically, they were a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And one of the many that are out there, and basically people use it for antidepressant and other things like that. And it kind of changed the way I was doing things. I just got where I started being, I had a clean desk, you know, I was organizing. That's not me. I'm more creative. I'm out of the box.
So at what point, so you ended up in that spot of desperation.
Yeah.
The point where you were going to end your life. At what point did God grab a hold of you, and how did he intervene? We only have a short amount of time left.
Okay. It's very simple. One night after my kids were leaving, I just remember being so desperate about it. I remember kind of crying out to God, and then I just decided I was going to kill myself. And I was trying to figure out ways to do it because I'd seen people do it. And I was going through what would happen. And then I remember I went back in the room and I was just in tears. And I shut the bedroom door, and when I did, all of a sudden there was a Post-it note, 2 of them up on the door, and it was my kids. They were young at the time. One of them wrote, "Dad, I love you, miss you very much." The other one was like, you know, "I love you, Daddy, you mean everything to me." And that stopped me thinking, but I was so serious about doing it. And then other things happened a few weeks after that that just got so desperate, I decided, and there were more things that even happened. I just decided I was going to stop it. And so I was figuring out how to get a gun, how to do this, that, and the other. And I remember this was about 8 or 9 in the morning, and all of a sudden the knock on the door came on the door, and my dad was there. And he looked at me, he said, "You're not trying to hurt yourself or anything, are you?" And I couldn't even admit it. I mean, no, I'm not. And it was just like divine intervention very quickly. That's how that was.
Wow. Wow. So God, first it was through the letters, the Post-its from your children, then your dad asking you, realizing that something was wrong. What advice in the short amount of time that we have left would you give to that person who was thinking about ending their life?
You know, one thing I would say is, first of all, don't let your faith be dictated by your circumstances. They're temporal. And you're valuable in God's eyes. And you were someone worth dying for. He died for you on the cross and gave his life for you. And knowing that made the difference in my life.
Amen. Thank you so much for joining us, Tom, and thank you for being so transparent and sharing your testimony. Well, we've reached the end of another program. Thanks for tuning in. Join us next time, and remember, it just wouldn't be the same without you.